Hey, what's up, everybody? It's your pal Gunner, here to talk to you about Cormac McCarthy and language representation. I'll be looking at the different ways that the author Cormac McCarthy, as well as some other writers, integrate Spanish into their English literature, use bilingual prose. And I'll be analyzing kind of the different motivations behind this, why different authors use it, and kind of the implications of bilingual prose as a whole. Okay, so real quick, kind of talk about the origins of this project. I just recently started reading McCarthy's Blood Meridian, and I've read a few of his books before, and it kind of reminded me of when I first started reading him in high school. My class was reading The Crossing, and a lot of people were up in arms because the novel features a lot of Spanish dialogue, just untranslated Spanish dialogue, because this is what McCarthy likes to do in his Western novels, is just have links of dialogue in Spanish without, exactly telling you what it means, if you don't speak Spanish, of course. And I was kind of interested in that argument, are you supposed to preserve the author's original intent and not look it up, or are you supposed to look up the translation so you know what's going on? Should you just learn Spanish so this isn't an issue? So that's kind of what I have in mind. I'm going to navigate through some different points here, but that argument is kind of the jumping off point for this project. Kind of the goal of this presentation is to look at that argument. I want to compare McCarthy to other bilingual writers and kind of see these different motivations and the ways that they integrate Spanish into their English literature. And then, put that translation argument to bed. And one other thing I will mention real quick is that, I'm not trying to talk about McCarthy like he's the pinnacle of Hispanic literature, because, look at him. He is an elderly white man. I'm just kind of like looking at him as an author that does use Spanish in some interesting ways in his literature, and some ways that I think stimulates some good conversation. So let's look at an example here. I have excerpts from two of his novels here. I swear I unintentionally picked that scenes that both took place in bars. I didn't really even have that in mind, but here they are, two different kind of exchanges going on in a bars, and All the Pretty Horses and Blood Meridian. And one difference between these two novels that I should mention right off the bat is that in All the Pretty Horses, the protagonist does speak Spanish. He's bilingual, and in Blood Meridian he doesn't. So if you read these two excerpts on your own, you can definitely see the differences. If the protagonist has different language background, the reader is going to have a different experience. And I won't read through these completely since they're lengthy and I don't want to mispronounce anything. But if you want to take a set to pause and really kind of break it down, feel free. I'd really appreciate it. But as you can see, if you haven't read McCarthy before, you might be kind of jarred by the fact that there's not any quotation marks, limited punctuation, kind of like a weird flow in between the prose and the dialogue itself. And this is exactly how it looks on the page. And it kind of creates an interesting landscape for the text. And a critic named Laura Callahan, sorry Laura Callahan, I shouldn't have started your name. I know Laura and I know each other very well. She made a really good point in a book that I'm going to mention again later, that McCarthy's kind of lack of punctuation, he's kind of known for having very limited punctuation usage. It works well with using English and Spanish together in the same book, because it kind of creates this seamless flow, whereas in other books the Spanish might be in italicized or translated in like a different way. In this, it's all just letters that all just kind of flows together in this seamless landscape of literature. That was a bit melodramatic, didn't mean to go that route, but I thought it was a really interesting point that Callahan made. So now to move on to another writer that you will all be familiar with, Gloria Anzaldúa. This is an excerpt from her essay, How to Tame a Wild Tongue, that we all read at the beginning of this semester. Summer. I don't know if this counts as semester or not. But Anzaldúa is obviously using Spanish in a very different way. It's a very different text, where she's just frequently alternating between English and Chicano Spanish. And with the case of Anzaldúa, the issue of language is very pertinent to her argument, the reason why she's writing. With McCarthy, I mean, the language and the culture itself still holds a degree of importance because he's writing about people that live in Mexico, New Mexico, and Texas during varying periods. But his inclusion of Spanish has become more kind of an artistic choice, a method of telling a story, whereas Anzaldúa, it's very much, the driving force of her argument, trying to give light to voices that aren't often heard. For her, the style and the substance are very much intertwined to create a very different kind of text. And now kind of in between these two previous writers is Ana Castillo in her novel So Far From God, which is a novel that uses a lot of Spanglish in her dialogue, a lot of alternating quickly between English and Spanish, like Anzaldúa does. And she also, a lot of things aren't translated, like as in McCarthy. Although, in the case of Castillo, the words are given a lot more context around them, with familiar English words to make them a little bit easier to deduce, I think. Excuse me. But I thought Castillo, looking at these three writers kind of together, that she has kind of this interesting middle ground to blend the elements from McCarthy and Anzaldúa, and the fact that she is making stylistic choices with her language, but also giving voice to kind of underscored voices, interpreting stories that aren't often heard. So, with that in mind, we're going to move on to continue to compare these three. I made a nice little line graph there. And going back to my bestie Laura Callahan, whose Spanish-English code switching and written corpus was very helpful. She talked a little bit about McCarthy, just had a little bit on him, but talked more about code switching in general, which code switching is just a phrase used to describe kind of the frequent alternating between two different languages. It's usually kind of used in reference to Spanglish, which is why I'm hesitant to use it in reference to McCarthy, but you kind of get the idea. But she identifies kind of three main reasons that different authors will code switch or use bilingual language in their literature. And one would be just a linguistic variety, to just kind of have it be interesting, have like variety within the text itself, which I would say would be more kind of McCarthy's drive. Culture representation, to kind of highlight stories that aren't often heard. I mean, language itself is an exercise of culture, so that's notable, and that's kind of what I said Anzaldúa more was. And then finally she said, I kept this in quotations just because it was so well put, was we get the enrichment of communicative repertoires. And now, as you can see on the line graph, this is a very one-dimensional line graph. Don't put too much value in it. I'm just kind of communicating how I'm thinking about these three authors. Obviously, McCarthy has some cultural representation in his books, and Anzaldúa has linguistic variety in her books. But I thought this was kind of this is kind of how I was thinking about them, is kind of on this graph here, and with Ana Castillo kind of as a bridge between these two motivations. And then with all three of these authors, I would contend we get enrichment of communicative repertoires. You could argue about the degree to maybe which with each one achieves this, but I think just by blending English and Spanish together and giving voice to people of different cultural backgrounds, you're in some way engaging your reader, maybe in a way they're not used to, whether they speak English or speak Spanish or don't. They're engaging a part of the brain they might not normally do. So, in that respect, I think all three do achieve the enrichment of communicative repertoires that Callahan is talking about. And now, to move back to the original argument that started this whole shebang, are you going to translate or are you not going to translate when reading McCarthy? What are you going to do? I already kind of talked about some of McCarthy's motivations. I'm going to go into a little bit deeper now. I come up with 3 A's. I tried really hard to make sure that these were 3 A's for McCarthy's Spanish usage. The first reason that he uses Spanish in his text is for accuracy. It makes sense to have characters speaking Spanish for the regions and eras that he's writing about. And second, 2 and 3 really kind of tie together because McCarthy is very aware that most of his readership are like white Americans, most of whom do not speak Spanish. So he uses ambiguity in his language in some really interesting ways. kind of forcing the reader to, assuming they don't speak Spanish, look at these Spanish sections and try to use context to understand what they're saying. And kind of moving on to number 3, this is used in some interesting ways to preserve a degree of realism within McCarthy's world. I mean, experience the scene like if you're really experiencing it. If I don't know any Spanish, but I hear a conversation in Spanish, there's still things to interpret. So I think that's a really interesting storytelling device. And to make sure that each reader has a different experience, as I kind of have with this Christopher T.Y. quote from Dreaming the Border trilogy. Kind of obviously in any book, a reader is going to bring something different to the table, but kind of with the way McCarthy uses language, clarity can very much depend on your background in language and your ability to kind of look at context. So it's a challenging reading experience, but it's also very interesting and rewarding, and it's very intentional. I think McCarthy, by having Spanish usage and not translating it, is very much showing us the world as it is, showing the scene as it is, and that's why my verdict is no. Don't translate it, man. Like, what are you doing? Don't even do it. I'm just kidding. You can, if you really want to, go into like the translation, but I think that McCarthy very much intends for us not to translate it. Maybe go out and learn Spanish, then we would like really be getting the full experience. That'd be a nice thing to take away from this if you could. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you for joining me, and for all the moment you've been waiting for, citations. Take a gander at those. All right. Thank you.